Hello, friends. This is part 5 of our Perspectives on Suffering series. If you have not watched part 1, 2, 3, and 4, I would encourage you to do that before just hitting this one. So, part 1 was the prologue of Job. Part 2, we asked, is Job to blame for his suffering? Part 3, we looked at lament. God can handle our unfiltered feelings and thoughts. Part 4, we looked at chaos. And now today. And I want to remind you that these are perspectives. People who are in the midst of suffering, crisis, trauma, attribute some kind of meaning to what they are experiencing. And it's been shown over and over that having a bad explanation is better than no explanation. And so these are perspectives, because if I said this is the only way to look at this and that unraveled something for you, sometimes when it unravels something for a person who's going through trauma and suffering, it makes them unable to cope. It just sends them into like existential crisis. They don't know how to go on. And so if this unravels something for you in a way that is really messing you up, it's okay to set this on the shelf, set it aside, and you can come back to it later. All right, let's jump in. The year was 1985, and Edith Turner was on her way to spend more time with the Ndembu people of Zambia, Africa. Years earlier, Edith and her husband had lived with the Ndembu people along with their 3 young children. Edith was an anthropologist, a distinguished lecturer at the University of Virginia, and an author. The Ndembu people had some strange and disturbing beliefs about the spirits, and they engaged in these strange rituals led by Ndembu doctors. And Edith was all about studying those rituals. So, for instance, the Ihamba tooth ritual. When someone was suffering, they believed it was possible that person had been invaded by the tooth of a dead hunter, and the tooth was believed to be some kind of a spirit. And the idea was that this tooth traveled along the veins of the suffering person, biting them, causing them infection and tremendous pain. So within the ritual, the community would drum and sing as a means of drawing out the spirit and getting rid of it. Now, while Edith lived alongside the Ndembu people, she always kept a certain distance between their experience and her own experience. She had always done that. After all, an anthropologist's work was to examine certain features of the group of people. Like you listen, you interact, you record what people say and do, but from a safe distance, simply observe. The task of observing rituals led anthropologists to notice certain aspects of the ritual, metaphor, symbol, the psychology within the culture. They paid attention to what it is that gives meaning to the lives of the natives, like examine the features of the ritual. And then whatever happened in the ritual was explained in terms of social dynamics. So with the Ihamba tooth ritual, an anthropologist's task was to explain why this ritual meant so much to the people and what was happening psychologically and socially. At this particular Ihamba tooth ritual, Edith had an experience that cracked her worldview. A woman was suffering great sickness, and it was suspected that the cause of her suffering was Ihamba. So within the ritual, the drums were beating, the people were singing and clapping, everyone was joining in, and the ritual was at its climax. It was the moment of lifting. The doctor bent, put his hand over the back of the woman in pain. The woman's back began to quiver rapidly, and Edith watched a giant thing come out of her back. It was large, about 6 inches across, kind of spherical, a grayish, smoky blob, this large opaque blob of protoplasm suspended coming out of her back. Edith called it a miserable, afflicting substance, something purely bad, a ball of ick, the ihamba. And Edith watched the Ndembu doctor grab it out of the air and put it in a bag. And there was no explaining away what she had just experienced. She went on to write multiple books and papers on this experience and others, and to say what she knew she was not supposed to say as an anthropologist. The spirits are real. I could go on to tell you similar stories. In my time with the Grand Ron people, I came across the story of a boy who was terribly sick. The white doctors tried but couldn't help. The boy spent 9 days unconscious with a high fever before the First Nations doctor was able to arrive, and they did a ritual. In the midst of the ritual, she pulled what was called a lol worm, this spirit curse kind of a thing, out of this sick boy's head and bit it to kill it. I could tell you an exorcism story that my dad experienced. Stories like these make people react in all kinds of ways. There are people who are highly uncomfortable with this topic. If you're talking spirits, devils, demons, it scares them. It makes their hair stand on end. Even if there is such a thing as spirits or demons, they really don't want to talk about it. There are others who are highly intrigued. They want to know more about the spirits. They want to experience and dabble. They're willing to dial that phone, even if they really aren't sure who's picking up on the other end of the line. Some people are highly skeptical. They're in the place that perhaps someone like Edith was before everything changed for her. So they explain everything away as social dynamics and psychology. So they would say devils and demons are like outdated superstition for the uneducated. They'd say any evil in the world is the result of unhealthy thought patterns, and the only thing that's really threatening this planet are people. Of course, that's a very white viewpoint. It's a more recent viewpoint, and it dismisses the belief and testimony of cultures across the planet and throughout history. For some people, devils and demons are comic book figures of our imagination. So you start talking in this way, and they're thinking like Darth Vader and Thanos and Voldemort kind of stuff. For others, they've been wounded by a form of religion that sees a devil under every bush. So they may have been told that their illness or their mental health condition was a demon. They may have had someone even try to cast it out of them. So for some folks, when they hear this kind of talk, devils and demons, they're like seriously pumping the brakes and running in the other direction. And I think for a lot of people, they just say, my life is hard enough without needing to worry about something I can't see, worrying about devils and demons. Like, I'm overwhelmed and exhausted, and I have 50 things coming at me. I'm so busy. I have enough problems and enemies that I can see. I just don't have time to worry about devils and demons that I can't see. And at the bottom of it all, there are plenty of people wondering, like, what difference does it make whether or not I think devils and demons, cosmic forces of evil, are real? So, our first discussion question today is, what's your gut reaction to the topic of devils, demons, cosmic forces of evil? Like, name your first response. No judgment, no arguing, no correcting one another. Just name. When this topic comes up, how does it strike you? What's your first response? So pause the video and have that conversation. The story of Job starts out with a scene in heaven. Job chapter 1, the divine council, God and the sons of God. And the accuser shows up and accuses God of ruling the world with raw power, with manipulation, with fear. Basically, God, you control humans by blessing them if they please you and cursing them if they offend you. Obedience is a self-serving bargain. Holiness is an illusion. Rather than responding as a God who does all of those things, who rules with fear and power and manipulation, rather than just booting Satan out of heaven, God engages Satan's accusation according to Satan's terms and says, very well, everything Job has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. And then when Satan pushes even further, God says, very well, Job is in your hands, but you must spare his life. And then we have chapter 3 to chapter 38, Job talking with his friends, arguing. And on the surface, it seems like they're arguing about whether or not Job deserves to be suffering. But the real question that this book of poetry is wrestling with is the accuser right about God? That's the real question. See, Job has been trying to understand why God is treating him unjustly. And so Job has been accusing God. God rushes at me like a warrior. God bares his teeth at me. God stalks me like a lion. God destroys the blameless and the wicked. When a plague sweeps through, God laughs at the death of the innocent. The whole earth is in the hands of the wicked, and God blinds the eyes of the judges. And then Job asks this pivotal question. He says, if God is not the one who did this, then who did this to me? That's an important question. If God isn't the one who did this, then who is? So when God appears to Job out of the storm to defend his justice, he ends up giving this defense where he describes the complexity of the universe. He gives Job a tour through the zoo, so to speak. He asks Job if he can rule the universe for a day. And then he describes these two animals. Last week we looked at Behemoth, and this week we're looking at Leviathan. And that's where he ends, is with this detailed description of Leviathan. So in ancient Near Eastern mythology, if someone mentioned Leviathan, people didn't just think, oh, that's like the Loch Ness Monster or something. They thought of the embodiment of cosmic evil. Throughout history, throughout scripture, through religions, cultures have known this cosmic force for evil by many names. So the Bible uses the language of the sea, the waters, Rahab, morning star, twisting serpent, the gods, the accuser, Lucifer, Satan, legion, demons, the prince of this world, devil, tempter, enemy, Beelzebub, principalities and powers, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, and of course Leviathan. And other religions call this Ahriman, Iblis, Brahma, Jinn, Shaitan. Leviathan was known as this sea serpent that encircled the earth. He was ferocious, had 7 heads. So you see that ancient carving there. Able to shoot fire out of his mouth. Leviathan was the embodiment of cosmic evil. If you think of Revelation, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, we still see this imagery of like a 7-headed monster again. Is the point to read these descriptions of this monster, Leviathan, literally as if this is the true and only form that Satan may take? Well, that's not reading the literature in the way that it's meant to be read. The book of Job, poetry. Uh, if you read it, we're about to read Job chapter 41. If you read it as oh, this is the only way that Satan might look, it quickly makes what God is saying seem outlandish. You'd say, oh, I've never seen a dragon thing like this threatening the planet. Uh, so it begs a different question, which is, do these descriptions throughout the Bible, do they simply make all kinds of connections with the wide variety of ways that cultures and peoples throughout history have thought of the embodiment of cosmic evil? The prologue of Job showed us that Satan is the culprit behind this whole mess. And now, as the capstone of God's argument for his justice, God is bringing Leviathan, Satan, to light. And just like Job can't control chaos, can't make a hawk able to fly, can't create frost, God shows Job how helpless he is before Leviathan. So let's read it. Job chapter 41. God says to Job, can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of it like a bird or put it on a leash for the young women in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you'll remember the struggle and you'll never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who, then, is able to stand against me, says God? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven, including Leviathan, belongs to me. God continues, I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from its mouth. Strength resides in its neck. Dismay goes before it. The folds of its flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. Its chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron it treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make it flee. Sling stones are like chaff to it. A club seems to it but a piece of straw. It laughs at the rattling of the lance. Its undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. It makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Thank you, God. Thank you, God, for this long and unsettling description of the embodiment of cosmic evil. Is this supposed to make me feel better? Like for Job, he's still suffering. He's still incredibly sick and he's lost his kids and his farm. Like, okay, thanks for telling me about Leviathan. Like, what is God doing? God is supposed to be defending his justice, and he just gave detailed description of a dragon. Well, God is finally naming the real enemy. See, Job thought that God was the warrior and that God's teeth were in him. He could only see one author of his pain. And so God is giving Job an up close look at whose teeth have torn his life apart. Leviathan's teeth, Satan, the warrior, the king over all who are proud. Leviathan has been masquerading as God to the point that God is getting blamed for all kinds of injustice. And so God is now revealing who's really responsible for all of this destruction and suffering. Whatever or whoever we are talking about here, God's making it clear that there's more going on in the universe than simply humans relating to God. It's not as simple as God's will and human will as the only two variables affecting what happens. God's showing Job there's more going on behind the scenes. So he's naming this player in the cosmic battle that's going on, and humans suffer because of it. So when you suffer and you pray and your prayers aren't answered, it might not be as simple as there's a God who doesn't care or as a Christian who lacks faith. Because basically what God is getting at is humans aren't the only thing threatening this planet. That's what God's getting at with Job. There are forces that have rebelled against God and are hostile to God's world. God has said, whatever weapons you might throw at Leviathan, that's what he eats for breakfast. He eats iron like straw. He has no equal. There's no such thing as cutting a deal with the devil where you win. There's no such thing as turning Leviathan into a pet, as if you could play games with Satan and win. And Leviathan is not alone. That's the last line there of what God says. Leviathan is king over all that are proud. He's trying to set up his own divine council. And so the Bible describes this cosmic force for evil as this group that's trying to work backwards in the universe, trying to undo creation, to dehumanize, to capture and enslave the ego and the imagination of human rulers, and hence humanity, to create what Marva Dawn calls a new morality of survival, where the measure of right and wrong is basically decided by slavery to the fear of death. Like, you're so afraid of death that if you can do something to escape it, it doesn't matter if it's really right or wrong. And so God names Leviathan as part of the created order. He says everything under heaven within this description of Leviathan, including Leviathan, belongs to me. So it's not like Leviathan is self-existent. It's not like Satan is an equal and opposite force to God, like people think of yin and yang. That's not the picture that God is painting. It's not like God created this good world and then Satan came in as an alien force to try to destroy it all. But then we ask, okay, so if God created Leviathan, what, like these cosmic forces of evil, why would God do that? Why would God create cosmic forces of evil that are constantly opposed to him? Why would God create Satan and demons? Well, the answer takes us back to a phrase that we find throughout the Bible: the sons of God, the divine council, the gods, the angels, the messengers. To make it simple, let's just use that word angels for a bit. So, a quick discussion question here before we really jump into that. When someone says, oh, they're just an angel, when they use that word, what does that tell you about that person? What kinds of assumptions do we make about angels? So, pause the video and have that conversation. All right. Did you talk about halos? Did you talk about someone who can do no wrong? You know, it's funny how we assume that angels are perfect, but that's not really the picture that the Bible paints of angels, or whatever we want to call these non-human agents that God created. Whether or not we call them angels, God created powers other than himself. And just like humans, God gives them the power of free choice, which means they can choose to rebel, to be endlessly opposed to God, trying to undo creation. The cosmic forces of evil are God's creation, but they have turned against God. So Psalm 82 stands out as a fascinating example of God, Yahweh, talking to the gods. And it captures this lament of God to the gods, the divine council, these non-human agents that God has created. And here's what God says. He's speaking to the angels here. How long, see, hear that lament note? How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? He's talking to the angels here. Defend the wicked, or defend the weak, sorry, and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. You notice how God talks to the gods, the angels, the divine council, in the same way that God talks to humans? They're intent on oppressing the most vulnerable. And rather than God immediately ending their existence because they're doing that, notice how God's speaking. God is lamenting and begging and pleading for a change of heart. He's saying, how long are you going to do this? So God offers these angels who have turned against him invitations back to defend and uphold the weak, the poor, the oppressed, the needy. The Bible makes it clear that God did not create perfect angels before inviting them into his work. And if you look back at Job 41, verse 11 and 12, just after calling Leviathan a part of the created order, God almost sounds like he's bragging about Leviathan's strength and his graceful form, as if Leviathan was created as good, but has become endlessly opposed to God. And as if within this, chapter 41 is mostly like, wow, Leviathan is pretty destructive. You wouldn't want to mess. But you've got this line where it's like God is still noting there's some real strengths here that I've created with this creature. So if you thought that God's process of working with the world was messy enough, just looking at chaos last week, try adding in Leviathan and the cosmic forces of evil. People like to talk about guardian angels, but Psalm 82 sure gives a picture of threatening angels who oppose God's will. And so God's working with them, trying to woo them back. I mean, talk about a situation with mixed results. Now, perhaps you've heard people say that anytime you pray, God's answer to your prayer is something like yes, no, or wait. And if that's all there is, sometimes the answer to our prayers makes God appear similar to Job's picture of God in the middle of the book of Job. Not a very pretty picture. We ask these same questions that Job asks, like, Why would God say no to alleviating suffering? And so that's why God wants to make it clear that there's more going on. And that's his final defense of his justice. The book of Daniel, chapter 9 and 10, tells these two stories of Daniel praying to God because of suffering and grief, saying things like, Lord, listen, forgive, hear, and act. Do not delay. And both stories of Daniel praying make sure to tell us that as soon as Daniel began to pray, his prayer was heard by God and God responded. Both stories tell us that for sure. And God responds in both stories by sending angels with tasks and messages. And so in the first story, you see that in the left column there, the angel shows up immediately, like while Daniel's still praying, an angel shows up. And Daniel uses this language of the angel coming in swift flight, like boom, right there. Now, in the second story, it's the very next story, Daniel chapter 10. Daniel prays and he sits around in prayer and mourning for 3 weeks, 21 days, absolutely no response from God. And 3 weeks go by, and then an angel shows up. And the angel says that 3 weeks ago, God heard Daniel's prayer and sent him in response. But then he says this really interesting, tells this story. He says, I was detained by the prince of Persia, like this angel, a rival angel, an angel opposed to God. And he resisted me. And he says, I had to get support from Michael, the archangel. And so uh, now he's there with Daniel. But then he goes on. He says, I'm going to have to go back to the fight against the Prince of Persia. And he says, well, I expect that I'll probably have to fight the Prince of Greece, like this other rival angel as well. Really, really wild stuff. So the reason that Daniel's prayers weren't answered in a timely fashion wasn't because God said no or wait. Like you've got Daniel chapter 9 and 10 shows this other option. It's not just yes, no, or wait. There's angel skirmish. Jesus tells the parable of a farmer who sows a field full of beautiful, good wheat. But when the wheat begins to sprout out of the ground, all the workers realize that the field is full of weeds mixed in with the wheat. And so the workers come to the farmer and they say, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Like, where'd these weeds come from? And they're basically asking the question that our entire world is asking. Like, God, I thought you created the world good. So why do we have all these bad things happening to good people? Like, why so much tragedy and disaster and devastation? God, is this really your plan? Coronavirus, fires, poverty, on and on and on. Now, obviously, the farmer doesn't want to ruin his wheat with weeds. So the farmer doesn't say to the workers who are saying, didn't you sow good seed in your field? He doesn't say, well, guys, it's all a part of the plan. He says, if you look at Matthew 13, 24 through 30, the farmer says, an enemy did this. It's an important line. An enemy did this. And so then the workers ask, okay, so do you want us to go out into the field and pull up the weeds? And the farmer says, no. He says, if you do that, you might end up uprooting the wheat. So then he says another important line. Let them grow together until the harvest, and then we will sort it out. And that functions as a decent metaphor for the world that we find ourselves in today. Growing together, and God will ultimately sort it out. Jesus is telling us that when we encounter weeds in the wheat, when we encounter suffering, trauma, evil, oppression, we can stop blaming the farmer. You remember the center point of the Lord's Prayer It's may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Aligning your will with God's will starts to matter a lot more when you realize that humans aren't the only thing threatening this planet. The enemy is not the weeds. The enemy is the one who planted the weeds. So behind the arguments about most recently socialism and capitalism is a power that wants to enslave us to greed, mammon, consumerism. Or behind the arguments about should we fund the police or should we defund the police, there's a beast that's been fed for centuries using systemic racism to turn humans against one another. There's a power attempting to convince us to justify anything and everything in order to escape death. There's a power that doesn't care who wins the wars, as long as violence is the answer to everything. Just so long as freedom is another word for killing, and we can tell ourselves we're bringing peace by war. There's a power that doesn't care really who becomes president, as long as the allegiance of the people can be captured. Nationalism, idolatry to empire. Behind every good guy, bad guy scenario is a power trying to convince humans to destroy one another. There's a power trying to ruin relationships and marriages by turning love into a commodity, like use sex to sell everything and define love by pleasure. Behind all the weeds, there's a power that's working backwards, trying to undo creation. And so Jesus teaches us this prayer: may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's if God is working in this complex world against these cosmic forces of evil, and God is respecting so many different wills, and I'm aligning my will with God's will. And God is victorious in the end. The Bible's clear about that, over the forces of evil, the forces that refuse to bend their will to God's will. Leviathan, Satan, demons, whatever name you want to use. God is also patient, wooing, lamenting, inviting his creation, human and non-human, to align their will with his, allowing the weeds and the wheat to grow together until God sorts it out. So, your final discussion question today. What aspect of this perspective on suffering is most helpful to you? And what aspect is most troubling to you? It's okay to be in process, but at least engage with it. What does this make you think? No need to debate, simply let what you share with one another be and listen well.